Thank you, Chamila. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, my dear evening colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen. It was indeed a pleasure that I was invited, despite my laxity in not agreeing to submit the abstract in proper form, due to, of course, the usual excuse we in the black coat say, that is lack of time. Nevertheless, I am grateful for the organizers of this event finding a way to accommodate me to participate in this event, in this symposium. The paper which I am about to submit is actually part of my dissertation, which I completed during my evening year at Edinburgh. I was reading for my Masters of Law. This topic is part of my dissertation. And again, being the lethargic person I am, I managed to prepare a separate paper extracting from the dissertation I did for my master's. But to give a background idea before I embark on this topic, why this inquiry of the Sri Lankan understanding of unitary state was even necessary, is because of what I was trying to search. In Sri Lanka, there is a common rhetoric we all hear, we all are very aware that the unitary character of Sri Lanka will never be compromised. It is a political rhetoric we've been hearing at least for the past 3 decades, if not from independence. So there seems to be some kind of a reverie of this idea of unitary state in Sri Lanka. It has been a very fundamental topic, or rather a hot topic, in the political discourse as well as in the legal discourse in this country. This country saw a war, and there is still a post-war ethnic conflict, political negotiations going on. At least until 2019, there was active discourse going on about this idea of unitary state. We heard the terms Ekiya Rajya being an alternative presented as a common compromise. Why all this was necessary is another interesting question. That is because Sri Lanka, on one perspective, has different ethno-nations within this country. So when there are competing political interests in between different ethno-nations, where different ethno-nations seek political devolution of power, then there has to be a model to devolve that power. In the standard world, we see, or in the traditional world, we see the power of a state, or the usual modality of power devolution in a state being contradistinctively identified as either unitary or federal. So what is unitary? The definition of unitary, in many sense, is defined in contradistinction to what is federalism. So why, among several thousands of definitions, you may question why I chose the definition of K.C. Ware. That is because Ware's definition is the definition that our Supreme Court, in interpreting the Sri Lankan Constitution, adopted to find the meaning or define the meaning of unitary state. So basically what Ware says is that in a federal constitution, there will be the sovereign power will be shared between the center and regional governments, where in a unitary state, in contradistinction to the federal arrangement, the power will be lying, the sovereign power will be lying with the central parliament. Now this we could say, of course, from A.V. Dicey to where this idea all came from, where we, or most of my evening colleagues were privileged to study at, from the United Kingdom. So from the United Kingdom, the idea of this sovereign, central sovereign came about, where unlike our constitution, where we say the sovereignty lies with the people, in the UK, the sovereignty is perceived to lie in Queen in Parliament, basically the Westminster Parliament. So after seeing this definition, where the Sri Lanka Supreme Court or the idea of unitary state have been adopted from the UK, I started wondering how the United Kingdom, being a unitary state, or being the fountain from where this idea of unitary state was inspired by our country, how did they manage to devolve power to the Scots, to the Welsh, and to the Northern Ireland? United Kingdom up to date remains a unitary state. Yet, there is a Scottish Parliament, there is a Northern Ireland Parliament, and there is a Welsh Assembly. And there is asymmetric devolution of power within that state. So this inquiry, this is exactly why I wanted to compare Sri Lanka's understanding of unitary state with the British understanding. So, according to Ware's definition, as I explained, the unitary constitution has two major characteristics: the central legislature being supreme and the absence of other sovereign bodies except the central legislature, which is upheld by our Supreme Court. When we introduced the 13th Amendment, the Supreme Court made a determination on the 13th Amendment, and the Warean definition was reiterated by our Supreme Court. But Ware in his definition had a caveat, a very interesting caveat. Ware said, a constitution, unitary and highly centralized on paper, may be almost federal in practice. A federal constitution may be, in practice, unitary. So this caveat, why I call it a caveat is, Ware gave a definition which we followed. Ware also gave a caveat to that definition, which has been rather ignored for a very long time. Now, when I was looking how the United Kingdom realized this devolution within a unitary state idea, having sovereignty lying with the Westminster Parliament, still powers being devolved, as not in a symmetric way, but in an asymmetric way, as and when what is demanded by the different nations. Neil Walker's explanation, a celebrated professor in constitutional theory, is quite interesting. I found it very, very much interesting. A unitary constitution based upon doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty is a formal rather than a substantive notion. So in the United Kingdom, it appears that the idea of unitary state is rather a formal idea rather than a substantive notion, where on paper it remains unitary, but in practice it is a flexible notion. And how that is sustained is that it is sustained through political will. If you ask me, in strict legal terms, can the Westminster Parliament abolish the Scots Parliament? Yes, it can. But if you also ask, will the Westminster Parliament abolish the Scottish Parliament? Perhaps the answer is no. And this is where the distinction between a legal constitution and a political constitution comes about. So it's quite interesting. We may have to trace back a little bit of history, but I think that would take long, and this is not the forum. I have my paper online in SSRN. Whoever is interested can go through that. I have referred to some sources on historical and anthropological work, but there is this new obsession in Sri Lanka, as I said, this rhetoric about unitary state. And it appears to me that this rhetoric flows from the mytho-historic text Mahavamsa. So the Mahavamsa story, this is taken from, the words are taken from, within quotes are taken from the translation. The Mahavamsa believes on one ethno-nationalistic sovereign. So that history with a usable past, is imported by ethno-nationalist politicians. But if you ask whether there was indeed a single sovereign in Sri Lanka, in the meaning of a single sovereign that's given in the Western sense, celebrated anthropologists like Leslie Gunawardena says, no, there is no evidence whatsoever. So it is a political construct in Sri Lanka that the ethno-nationalist politics, based on a mytho-historic text and continuous rhetoric, built up an idea of a usable past of a sovereign, single sovereign, which through political manipulation, if I have to use the word, or political process, the recreation of that was intended. So we see, that is why we see this idea of a single sovereign could only be traced post the 1940s or 1930s and the 1940s. Before that, when this country was in the verge or in the process of independence or having local domestic governance through various constitutional statutes, there were serious debate across the table, not strictly on ethnic lines, on what model of governance that should be incorporated in this country. So we see the celebrated ethno-nationalist politician, soon after coming back from Oxford, advocating for a federal state in Sri Lanka. However, after realizing that there is a great potential for nationalistic, especially ethno-nationalistic political reverie, he went on to choose a different path. So I don't want to dwell much on history. So later we see this country going through serious ethnic conflict, war, armed groups, and then India intervenes, and a solution, something similar to the Indian arrangement, which some are happy to call quasi-federal, which is a quite unique arrangement in India. Once again, a unitary state, but devolving certain powers to its regional units. When it came about, the 13th Amendment, a similar arrangement, was intended to be implemented in Sri Lanka, and our Supreme Court had an opportunity to present an interpretation to the term unitary. And our Supreme Court adopted the variant idea of unitary state. That is, there can only be one sovereign body, which is in the center, the central government, and regional governments can only be a subsidiary to that sovereign power. Now, this clearly shows that the idea of a central sovereign, a single sovereign, is very much sacrosanct or perceived in a sacrosanct way in Sri Lanka. This is quite opposite to what Professor Walker says. It's not merely formalistic, but the idea of unitary state is a very substantial, very substantive notion in Sri Lanka. So, if we compare the difference, I was saying that this idea of unitary state diverges from the approach which is taken by the United Kingdom, where the United Kingdom moves in the opposite way of making the idea of unitary state more formalistic. Yes, we are the United Kingdom, but yes, the Westminster Parliament is the sovereign, but having a political will to make a different arrangement when it comes to power devolution. Quite interestingly, the variant caveat I mentioned about this formalism was recently recognized, although obiter. Now, obiter means in legalese the fact that is not the deciding aspect of the law, but some passing comment, if I have to use that layman's term to explain the word obiter. Although obiter, the Supreme Court mentioned that although in paper it could be unitary state, in practice it could be federal. A state which is federal in paper could in practice be unitary. So this idea was, but it's quite interesting because after a very long time, after so much obsession with this idea of one single sovereign, the Supreme Court went on to recognize, although obiter, that this is a possibility. But we continue to say that the political will to proceed in the path of the United Kingdom, where to treat this idea of unitary state as a formalistic concept, did not politically materialize. We saw the interim report of the Constitutional Assembly in 2017, again debating over the same issue. So, after analyzing this, I came to a conclusion that this idea of unitary and federal is no more appropriate to describe the form of state, the model of state that we are. Because nation building and state building happens in very different ways in different parts of the world. Yes, we have been inspired by certain Western thoughts, especially I would say English thoughts, in developing or structuring our governance arrangement. But even when we detached ourselves from that and went on to create an autochthonous constitution, that is some idea of creating, that is what we did in 1972, creating the idea from our soil, very autochthonous idea, we still are left with the hangover from these ideas just pulling us towards it. So I think Sri Lanka has to reach a compromise. There are competing political interests, and the competing political interests cannot be satisfied within this existing idea of a unitary state and federal state, and we may have to think beyond these ideas, was my conclusion in this paper. Of course, I go on to look at the South American option of plurinational states, which could perhaps be a model to resolve the political conflict in this country. So that is my presentation for today. I hope I did not surpass my time limit, and if anyone has any question, I will be happy to answer. Thank you.